going to name some NBA players. I want you guys to let me know if you think they're overrated, fairly rated, or underrated, and just give a brief explanation of why you think that. Let's start off with Neil. Jarrett Allen.
Jarrett Allen, I think, is underrated. He is a great duo with Evan Mobley, and Evan Mobley is getting all the hype, but Jarrett Allen kind of slips to the background. But he is a terrific player. He was actually the catalyst for Cleveland believing that they could become a good team, and then Evan Mobley put him over the top. So I say underrated.
Shai, what do you think? Overrated, fairly rated, or underrated?
I agree with Neil. I think he's an underrated player. He's, I guess, a bit less marketable because he's just kind of quiet, a bit more humble of a player. Incredible defensive player, good team player, good locker room guy. And I think for the reasons that Neil just said, I agree. Underrated.
Yeah, I agree too. I think he's underrated. I think even though he's not amazing offensively, all of his other intangibles, his defense, his rebounding, are extremely important. And I don't think he gets enough credibility for being that type of caliber player amongst his peers. So, and he's still super young, right? I think he's like 23 years old, so he still has room to grow offensively. So I think he's underrated as well.
Brooklyn could really use him right now.
They could use a lot of their young players that they got rid of, right? So even D'Angelo, I think, would be helpful. Okay, so Malcolm Brogdon, overrated, fairly rated, or underrated? What do you think, Cheyenne?
That is a really good one, and I'm gonna go with fairly rated. I think he is a solid addition to that Celtics team, and he really deepened that team. And I feel like if they had him against the Warriors, it would have definitely gone to Game 7, and they could have won. I think he's very fairly rated.
Yeah, it makes sense. What do you think, Neil?
I'm going to say a little bit overrated. He is a great player, but the problem is he can't stay healthy. And if you're not on the court, then you provide no value. And we'll see if he can stay healthy for the entire season for Boston. He's also hasn't really made a mark in the playoffs yet. So that remains to be seen if he can come up in the clutch. So I'm going to say a little bit overrated.
I'm going to say fairly rated because of his injury history. So he was the rookie of the year. He got derailed a little bit early in his career with injuries. He came back, had a few good seasons where he was playing really great defensively and also as a good playmaker and as a pretty decent scorer, right? Not the best three-point shooter, but he's essentially a 3-level scorer, not elite at all by any means, but I think he's fairly rated based on his injury history. I think he would have been considered more underrated if he wasn't hurt. And I think he's rated exactly where he's at. He's still a great player, but he has a lot of room to grow. He's still young. As long as he can stay healthy, then I think he's going to succeed and I guess help the freaking goddamn Celtics possibly win a championship. So hopefully not. We'll see. Okay, so next player, Nikola Vucevic. Neil, overrated, fairly rated, underrated?
I think he's a little bit overrated. He does put up 20 and 10. He's a very solid player, but it doesn't translate to winning. He spent most of his career with the Magic, and they went nowhere. He went to the Bulls. The Bulls had a great season, but I think that was more about Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan. And now the Bulls are trying to get rid of him because he's overpaid. So I'm going to go overrated.
What do you think, Cheyenne?
I agree. I think when he was in Orlando, he put up monster stats. He got a fucking max. Sorry, excuse my language. He got a lot of money to go to the Bulls. And I just don't think he's the type of like number one player that's going to lead you to like a victory, playoff kind of victory type of team. I think he's like a 1B, maybe even a third type of option. Doesn't deserve the max like he got.
I think you're more correct on the third. He was potentially the 1B, I think. So I think he's overrated too. I've seen a lot of him up close and personal as a Heat fan in our division, and he's a freaking Miami. He was a Miami Heat killer. Like his 20 and 10 average against the league was not what he averaged against the Heat. He would average like 34 and 15 for some reason in those 4 games against us and just killed us. And his skill set is great. He gets 20 and 10, for the last 5 years, but it doesn't translate to wins. He's not good defensively, and he's not that number 2 guy. I think you're correct, Cheyenne, in thinking that he has to be that third guy. And right now he technically is that third guy on the Bulls, but I just don't think Levine and DeMar are capable yet to leapfrog the Bulls ahead of the Celtics or the Bucks, or even the Heat, I guess. But yeah, I think you guys are right. He's definitely overrated. Here's a fun one. We're all Fresno boys, and so this is not a Fresno boy, but a Fresno Bulldog. This is Mr. LA himself. Finally got to play for his home team.
PG.
Not his home team, but I guess his second home team, but because he is a Laker fan. So Paul George, PG. Cheyenne, what do you think? Overrated, fairly rated, underrated? This is a tough one because we have a little bias over here. We got to root for him, even though we don't love him.
This is a really hard one because you have to think about Paul George's Indiana Paul George and then Clipper Paul George. And it's like Clipper Paul George with Kawhi and then Clipper Paul George without Kawhi. And he's really shown us without Kawhi that he's damn good. I'm just going to go with the middle option and say fairly rated because he puts up good stats. He can lead the team when he wants to with his attitude sometimes. Sometimes he's got a poor attitude. And it does translate to wins. Even without Kawhi, he was able to push the Clippers almost to being a playoff winning team.
Yeah, no, it's fair answer. Neil, what do you think?
I'm going to agree with Cheyenne. I think he is fairly rated. He puts up great stats. He's dealt with a lot of injuries. As Cheyenne mentioned, Kawhi has been dealing with a lot of injuries himself, but he took the Clippers to the West Finals. They'd never been there. No one gave him a chance against Utah. They pushed Phoenix. So I'm going to say he's fairly rated, but I think this is a very important year for him because you expect the Clippers to go deep and they need to live up to that run. So until we see what happens there, I'm going to say fairly rated.
Fair enough. I'm going to say fairly rated as well. I think in his early stages of his career, he was definitely semi underrated. He again against the Heat with LeBron in those days, he took us to 6-7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals 2 years in a row, and was going toe to toe with LeBron James when LeBron was 25 years old, like in his maximum prime. So I think at that point he was underrated, and then injuries have occurred, and kind of derailed his career in a sense, like as a top 5-10 type of player, and he was on that trajectory. So, but to your point, I think Cheyenne made a great point. Like with Kawhi out, he actually was able to take a Clippers team that wasn't very deep without Kawhi because they gave a lot up, right, to acquire these 2 players, and took them pretty far. And last year he missed a quarter or half the season with that, I think, elbow or wrist injury, and he came back and he got them into the play-in game, right, like without Kawhi. So I think he's fairly rated as well. And next year's definitely going to be an important year for him as well as for the Clippers. So I agree with both of you. All right, here's a fun one. Wishing Panos was on here for this one because I know exactly what he would say. Russell Westbrook. What do you think, Neil?
Early on, definitely overrated, but the narrative has turned so quickly against him that I think I'm going to go with fairly rated now. I mean, nobody wants to take a chance on this guy. The trade market for him has completely vanished to the point where now I think his valuation is proper. So I'm going to say fairly rated based on the past like 3-4 years. Everybody been trashing him.
Okay. What do you think, Cheyenne?
This is a tough one because, like, to Neil's point, it's like, what are we rating him against? Like, I am a little bit biased here. I didn't love Westbrook's attitude with the whole KD trade. He probably had every right to get upset, but he was a monster at OKC, obviously with triple doubles. So I think with the Lakers, I don't think Vogel's using him correctly. I think that hurt him a lot and made him look like trash on the Lakers. And even Laker fans are now wanting him out. So I kind of agree that he's fairly rated with the status quo right now that he's no longer a star point guard in the league. However, I guarantee if he runs in a different system next year or they change the system, he's going to prove a lot of us wrong and show us that like he can be an elite point guard again.
That's fair. I'm going to say, to go against the grain, underrated currently, and I'm going to piggyback off what Cheyenne said, saying that he was in possibly the wrong system. They had to deal with a lot of injuries, and Pelinka put together a pretty shitty team of geriatric players around LeBron, AD, and Russ. And he wasn't meant to be the number 2 guy. He was supposed to be the number 3 guy, but AD, who's made out of freaking glass, who's Mr. Sharman himself, who's soft, got hurt again and missed half the season. So he had to take on a lot more responsibility, and also the pieces around them were not effective. They got rid of the young talent, like the Carusos, and I think he's underrated in a sense compared to the rest of the point guards in the league. He's not a top star, like Cheyenne said. He's not like a top 10 guy, but he might be a top 10 point guard still in the NBA. I don't think he's a top 20 guy anymore. Maybe he's now in the 30s or so, but he's still a top 10 point guard, right? There's like 5 superstar point guards, but I think he might be like number 7, 8, 9, or 10. So I think he's underrated. And just because he's not shooting well doesn't mean he can't still be effective in the right system and maybe on the right team. So I'm going to say underrated, even though he's a freaking stat stuffer, right? And that doesn't show. That can lead to victory, right? By being able to get triple doubles, even though it is still pretty damn impressive. So
I'm glad we didn't all agree on that one. So thank you.
No problem. So here's a fun one. I like this guy. I don't like Toronto, but I like this guy. I don't like playing against this
Van
guy.
Fleet.
Oh yeah. So what do you think, Cheyenne? Fred VanVleet, overrated, underrated, fairly rated?
I think he's overrated. I do. I don't know. Maybe I just don't watch enough of him because like Toronto, like I think he's a great complement to a team that has 2 superstars already. Because he'll get some open shots, and he's a decent point guard that can kind of manage the game, I guess. But I don't think if I were a GM, I wouldn't have paid him what he's getting paid and tried to like build a team around him. Like I think he's a third option from like a star perspective on a team. So underrated.
Neil, what do you think?
Everything Cheyenne said is correct, but I'm going to say fairly rated because this guy was undrafted, had no prospects in the NBA. He carved out a role for himself in the NBA, won a championship. Usually when someone does that, they're going to get compensated at a premium. So that's what Toronto did. But yeah, if he was on the open market, he might not get that kind of contract. But I think if you take the whole picture, I think he's fairly rated.
That's yeah, good assessment. I'm going to say, to be different, underrated. And the reason I say that though is because you mentioned he was undrafted, and his first 2 years did not get any playing time, averaged 2 points and 8 points a game. He was the second fiddle to Kyle Lowry. So once Kyle Lowry has left, he's proven that he could be a good player on a good team. He's not like a good player on a shitty team where he's getting 50 shots per game and putting up stats of 20. I think he averaged like 20 points, 7 assists, a few rebounds per game. But he's not, to Cheyenne's point, that number 1 guy. Like he is like a Jalen Brunson type of guy that the Knicks just.
I was going to make the same comparison. That's
He's
a great comp.
Like his shooting has just become really great. Like he's a really good 3-point shooter and really effective, high percentage shooter, good playmaker, good scorer, but he is limited as well. So he's not that number 1 dude. He's getting paid essentially kind of like that number 1 dude. He is that number 2, 3 guy. Like he does need, superstars around him, better players than Siakam. I guess Siakam is pretty much the only real star they have right now versus young talent, like Scotty Barnes and a few other players. But I think he's just generally underrated because, to Cheyenne's point, he hasn't heard much about him because no one gives a shit about the Toronto Raptors. The media doesn't talk about him. So I think that plays into a slight factor of why I think he's underrated, plus the undrafted piece that you mentioned. So I think we all had
Fair. I think I just pegged him against his contract, and I was like, nope. But
fair.
Your
That's a fair.
guys' compares, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
That's an accurate way to assess somebody is what they're getting paid.
Oh, but if you do it that based on that way, then I'll say overrated for sure.
It's like there's so many people that are overrated then, right? With those contracts that are going out.
Duncan Robinson, again, this is a Miami Heat Junior podcast. That guy's making
Didn't even need to ask the question.
Dude, Duncan Robinson didn't play last year. He's making $90 million a year. Like, are you kidding me? Like, those contracts are insane. All right, here's a fun one, and I think I know the answer. This is the stupid question. I don't know why I'm going to ask this one out loud and say this out loud, but the unicorn, not Chet, not the new unicorn, not Mr. Bones,
The OG
Harmony, Mr. Skeletor, but the original Skeletor, Kristaps Porzingis. What do you think, Neil? Overrated, fairly rated, or underrated? If we all have different answers, I'm going to slap all of you guys, and including myself, in the face. Let's see.
100% overrated. It's sad to see the decline of KP. He was supposed to be that second star next to Luka. It didn't work. Now he got traded to Washington, and we'll see what happens with Bradley Beal, but this is fairly easy, overrated.
Okay. Cheyenne, what do you think?
Yes, I would say right now in the past couple of years, way overrated. Right when he came into the league, I was a believer that he was the unicorn and he was going to be what he was set out to be. But he's absolutely overrated right now, unfortunately. And it would have been so cool to see the European combo win a championship, but it's just not going to happen. And injuries suck, man.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think he's definitely overrated. Injuries, I think, play a big part of that. But even the last few years with Luka and on the Mavs, he proved that he wasn't that second option that Luka needed. And he, like, his averages went down significantly. Like his shooting percentages went down even while healthy. Like Luka needed someone who could give him like that Pau Gasol kind of second type big man to support his game. And, you know, he was averaging, again, initially when he was on the Knicks before he got injured, was averaging like 24 points a game, you know, like 10 rebounds. And the last few years with injuries, that obviously declined. But even when he was healthy, he still like was shooting significantly below his percentages. He was averaging like 17 points a game. He was rebounding like in the single digits too as well for like a 7-footer. Even though he was small, he still had a knack for rebounding early on in his career before the injuries. So like all of his statistics have been going down, and injuries could be a cause, but it's just unfortunate to see his trajectory. He's still young, you know, I think he's like 27, 26, 27. I don't know. He still has an opportunity to get back on track.
That's the thing with all these guys, right? They're still playing in the league, so they can change the narrative quickly. It's a moving target all the time.
Yeah, but he's not that all-star. He could be a star, but he's not that all-star, superstar, you know, type caliber player that we thought he could be. And here's another one as well, another former New York Knicks. Obviously one of the worst franchises, you know, along with the Sacramento Kings, who typically seem to make boneheaded picks and moves. And it was kind of funny on the draft podcast that you guys did, Neil. I don't know anything about college, so I wasn't part of that, but we thought the Sacramento Kings might have made a crazy move by not selecting, was it Jaden Ivey at number 4?
That's right, yeah.
They selected Keegan Murray, and I don't even know what school he went to. What school did you go to?
Iowa.
From Iowa. Field of Dreams, baby. Kevin Costner, great movie. Should watch it tonight. If you build it, they will come. We'll see. But Keegan Murray, they thought that was like, why are they not selecting the best talent, even though it might be redundant with De'Aaron Fox, with Davion Mitchell. Like sometimes you just got to take the best player available, even if it doesn't fit your need. And they took Murray, and he's actually doing pretty damn well, it seems like, in the summer league, right? I guess I haven't really watched, but I've seen some reports that he's been crushing it. So not to go off on a tangent, but New York Knicks. So again, this player, interesting player, not doing the best recently, but Julius Randle. What do you think about Julius Randle, Neil? Overrated, fairly rated or underrated? A young player who had a really good year last year, but not so much this year. What do you think?
This is a good one. I think Julius Randle's gone through a lot of ebbs and flows, a lot of peaks and valleys. I think before last season, I would say underrated, but then he fell over big time. And now the narrative is switching. So I think he's fairly rated now. After last season, he struggled and everybody has been talking shit. So he's accurately assessed by everybody right now. So I'm going to say fairly rated.
Okay. What do you think, Cheyenne?
This is a difficult one. To kind of Neil's points here. I think the issue with him is I'm going to go underrated still, because I think the issue with him is he's kind of a mental head case a little bit, but like not as obvious as like a D Cousins was. Like you saw D Cousins' talent and ability to be like a number one on a team and carry a team, but he was a mental head case and just couldn't handle it sometimes. And I feel like he falls into that boat a little bit. I think if he's got the right coaching staff and right team around him, he can be a really, really valuable asset. I don't think he can be like a number one player to lead a team to playoff victories, but I think he can be like a two, and help lead a team to victories and get to the playoffs. Very well-rounded player across the stat board, and seems like he has a pretty good basketball IQ in general when you watch him play with intangibles and things like that, but maybe a little bit of a mental midget.
I love it. Yeah, I don't know. I'm like kind of changing my answer on the fly. I think I was going to say overrated at first, Neil, but I think he's fairly rated. So his trajectory has gone up and up and up every year except for last year, basically, right? So like he was young, playing on the Lakers after Kobe, with Kobe, post Kobe, like became that was he the number one guy? Maybe number two after Ingram, but both of them were ascending together. Became a really, I guess, just versatile big, kind of like a Lamar Odom type of player, right? Who's good at scoring, rebounding, playmaking. Not the best defender. Had a really good year with the Knicks last year. We had 24 points per game, 11 rebounds. Was an all-star. Was he like on the All NBA team? I think maybe second team. This year he went down, but not by too much. But I think he's proven that he's not that number one guy. And it's, again, the New York Knicks aren't the best judge of talent, or they pretty much go all in too quickly on the wrong type of guy. And I just don't think he's that number one caliber guy, but he's still pretty young. He's still in his prime. He's 27 years old. He still has 3 to 4 more solid years within his prime. He averaged 20 and 10 last year, right? So it's not like he's a dud, but based on his trajectory, you thought he was going to do better. And the fact that he took the Knicks to the playoffs, you thought that they were going to continue to grow, especially with all their draft picks and players that they've put around him. So I think he's fairly rated, just based on hearing what you guys said.
Yeah, I think he's a good number 3, I would say.
Yeah,
That's fair. I agree with that. The number 3.
Number 3 for sure.